the myths of self-defense and both sides are growing more and more penetrable. People are being able to see through these myths and call an occupation for what it is and call an aggressor for what it is.
Shockingly, television news programs have had some actual, accurate coverage of Israel's human rights abuses against the Palestinians. And I have some clips to share. So this is not something you normally see in discussions around this issue, but maybe this is a sign of a positive trend. So if you want more detail on the actual most recent events that have been going on, I have a couple of videos up on that, including Canadian lawmakers react to Israeli strikes and Andrew Yang gets ripped apart over a sociopathic tweet. In both of these videos, I discuss the topic at hand here, but also go into the issue of what just recently happened between the Israeli government and Palestinians. But in this video, I want to share examples from the CBC, CNN, and MSNBC. So the first clip here that I'm going to share, CBC, of course, Canadian network. This is going to be Janella Massa, host of Canada Tonight on CBC News. She had on Rami Curry for a refreshing discussion on this issue. Check it out.
But speaking specifically to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, which is kind of what sparked off this most recent round of violence, some have likened that to ethnic cleansing. Israel calls it a private real estate dispute. What do you make of these very different characterizations of what's going on?
It is ethnic cleansing. Most of the world recognizes it as ethnic cleansing. It has been condemned by the United Nations, even by the Security Council, certainly the General Assembly many times. Nobody in the world except one or two little microstates supports the Israeli expansion into occupied Palestinian lands. There's been something like 620,000 Israelis who have been moved into colonies and settlements since 1967 in the West Bank and Arab East Jerusalem. And this is what Sheikh Jarrah is part of. This slow motion ethnic cleansing that's been going on for dozens of years. And the Israelis use different ways to do it. If a Palestinian spends too much time outside of Jerusalem, they take away the residence permit that allows that Palestinian to live in his or her ancestral home in Jerusalem. And these people become refugees. They can't go back to their homes. And that's one way they try to get rid of people. They forcibly expel people, like in Sheikh Jarrah. There are situations where settlers do this. There are situations, individual private thugs, situations where the Israeli army does it. So there's a variety of ways that Israel has used the Zionist movement in Israel over the last century to transform the land of Palestine, which had been around 1910, was 93% Palestinian and 6-7% Jewish, indigenous Jews who had always lived there. That ratio has completely reversed. What happened over the last century? Why did the majority of the Palestinians end up not being in Palestine? It's not just natural desire to immigrate. There is a process of forced eviction and expulsion.
All right,
and this is a war crime.
Now, when is the last time you've seen a discussion like this? For whatever reason, networks appear now more willing to represent the views of Palestinians and human rights organizations that have been calling out these abuses for years. So Rami Curry here, fantastic description and breakdown on what is going on. And also, I'm sure it's a shock for many Americans to see a hijab-wearing Muslim woman hosting a mainstream political show. Not something Americans are used to. But great job here from Janella Massa to have on this guest and have an honest discussion around this issue. Now, next clip, it's going to be Mohammed el-Kurd. He's a Palestinian writer who was forced from his home, and he's appearing on MSNBC.
What do you make of how the U.S. and the international community has responded to what is happening to your family? They are saying, the spokesperson for the State Department is saying today, that you have a right to safety and security while Israel has a right to self-defense. What do you say to U.S. officials in the international community?
The United States has waged more wars than there are Hamas members. I don't wait for the United States to tell me what constitutes as self-defense and what not constitutes as self-defense. That is not where my moral compass stems from. I don't think the United States is in position, given all of the genocides and wars it's partaking in, to say something about who has a right to self-defense. What I know is that a military occupation that we're living in is excruciatingly violent. A siege that we're living under is excruciatingly violent, and that is the aggressor. That is the occupier. That's what started all. That's fundamentally what started the so-called conflict.
All right. I'm not going to add too much to these clips because they kind of all speak for themselves, but I just quote Mohammed el-Kurd here, saying the United States has waged more wars than there are Hamas members. Incredible. And this is the kind of coverage that really, look, CBC, I understand Canada, the CBC have, not been great on this issue, but are more willing to have this discussion. MSNBC, though, and CNN, which I'm going to get to in a second, just to have this honest discussion here, to have this guest on who's actually been personally impacted by this, by the Israeli government, and discuss this open and honestly and in their terms, fantastic. We need to see more of this, and I hope this is a trend of more to come. Now, this guest is so fantastic that I'm also going to show you his appearance on CNN. So again, Mohammed el-Kurd had to, so in this first clip, I have two clips from CNN. He had to reframe the discussion from the start. Watch this.
Well, Mohammed el-Kurd joins me now from Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you very much for joining us. You grew up in the neighborhood. Your family home is slated for eviction. What is the scene right now?
Well, thank you so much for having me. To start, it's not really an eviction. It's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law, it also implies the presence of a landlord. And certainly these Israeli settlers have not built our homes. They're not our landlords. They don't own our land. And thirdly, eviction does not imply the hundreds and hundreds of heavily armed police and army and settlers colluding, blowing up your doors, throwing your children from your windows, and using brute force to throw you out in the street and assaulting and arrest you should you resist. It doesn't imply the grenades. It doesn't imply the rubber-coated bullets. It's not an eviction. According to the UN and countless politicians and human rights organizations, it could amount to war crimes. Actually, the situation is pretty tense, I can tell you, and we're very scared of losing our homes to Israeli settler organizations.
These settlers and courts would argue that their claims to the land predates you and your family. Have you been allowed to prove otherwise?
No. The Israeli occupation courts take their documents without verification, without authentication or challenge, whereas our documents will not be looked at. They will not be taken into consideration. Besides, just because something is technically legal does not mean it's ethical or moral or historically just or accurate or correct. We've seen many systems exploit the law and exploit the judiciary to uphold supremacist and racist lives.
All right, so I have one more clip coming up, but just one main point I want to discuss on this this video here. Mohammed el-Kurd reframes the discussion from the start. This is so important. If you are a guest on cable news and you know what you're talking about, you're educated, you want to inform people, oftentimes you're limited by how the discussion or the question is framed. So in this case, the question is framed from the perspective of the Israeli government, that these are simply evictions. Now, she doesn't say it, but built into that language is the idea that, well, the Israeli government owns that land, they have a right to that land, and that these are just people that are being evicted and they're not happy about it. When in reality, this is ethnic cleansing. The UN has called out these so-called evictions as such. They have called out the fact that these are oppressive actions by the Israeli government. These are human rights abuses. These are not simply evictions. These are forced evictions, but forced evictions that are essentially ethnic cleansing. So having that discussion reframed here by Mohammed el-Kurd is exactly what needs to be done if you're going to have an honest conversation on this issue. One more clip here, the last clip from his appearance on CNN.
You've written very powerfully about being 11 and remembering this incident that I spoke about these settlers coming to your home and taking half of it. How does it feel to have grown up with what you've called the anxiety of dispossession?
It feels familiar because this is what every Palestinian feels like under the crushing fangs of Israeli colonialism in Palestine. My grandmother was thrown out of her home in 1948 in Haifa, and she was thrown out again in 1967, and again in 2009 when Israeli settler organizations colluding with the Israeli state took over half of our home. And this is my second time being dispossessed from my family, should they go ahead and do it to me. It's scary, but it also has a name. It's settler colonialism, and it's apartheid, and it's the fact that these settler organizations are working together with the state to exploit the law to dispossess Palestinians.
What would you like from the international community? There has been a response by many to the situation your family is in right now. What would you like to hear, especially from the new Biden administration?
Well, you know, I think the myths of self-defense and both sides are growing more and more penetrable. People are being able to see through these myths and call an occupation for what it is and call an aggressor for what it is. And this is what we're going under, where we're facing in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, in Lid, is colonial violence. And it's only allowed because both the state and the settlers know they have impunity. The settlers are emboldened by an apartheid state that allows them to open carry in Palestinian neighborhoods. And the state is emboldened by an international community that refuses to call it out for what it is, that allows it to intentionally target civilian neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip and massacre 24 Palestinians, including 9 children, without facing any consequences. I don't expect much of the Biden administration, knowing that Ned Price refused to even condemn the killing of 9 Palestinian children tells me all I need to know. Obviously, I would like the international community to hold Israel accountable under international law, but I also hope free people of the world do their part to push their governments.
Just an incredible appearance here, and I hope we're going to see more of this. I have a feeling that Mohammed el-Kurd here was allowed on both these networks because there's an actual piece in the Washington Post that discusses him and his family. So sometimes, you know, there has to be an in like that. Like there's a piece on you in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that sort of, I don't know, I guess platforms you in a way for these more mainstream outlets, because discussions like the one you just saw on CNN and MSNBC are so incredibly rare. And think of some of the terminology brought up here in all 3 of these or all 4 of these clips. Ethnic cleansing, Israel is the aggressor, war crimes, settler colonialism, apartheid. This look over the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years of discussions on cable news about this issue. Very rarely, if ever, are some of these terms brought up. So for whatever reason, we are now having a more honest discussion, at least some parts occasionally on cable news, a more honest discussion about what is going on here. And this is a trend that I hope to see continue.